Da, da, da. Should be live now. Okay, I'm here with Kyle Broussard, and he's here to teach me a thing or two this time around. We're going to be talking about, let me see if I can maximize this screen here. Nope. Okay, I guess we'll just keep going. Should be live now. Okay, I'm here with... Oh, and now I've got the echo. Okay, I'm here with Kyle Broussard, and he's... So, we're here to talk about the rise of the right in Europe. So, Kyle, can you give me a basic rundown of what's been going on over there?
Yeah, sure. So within the last, I'm probably going to put it around to the last 10 years that we can really see a huge increase in the rise of populism. We can always go back in history and look at the Front National, which started out, in the 1960s and 70s. But really, we've seen a huge increase in momentum throughout the entire European area. We're seeing it in Britain with whether or not you want to. Pretty much everybody does see UKIP as populist. They're kind of in the middle, but that's the UKIP are pretty much the lightest version of populism that you can get in Europe right now. It's pretty much populism light. But what you are seeing when you're seeing the Danish People's Party, you're seeing the Lega Norda. Mixed with the Five Star Movement down in Italy, you're seeing the Danish People's Party, the People's Freedom Party in Poland. You see Viktor Orban, who has pretty much now been the front and center piece for the rise of populism throughout all of Europe. And you're seeing a lot of it pop up in Ukraine, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Austria as well with Sebastian Kurz. All of these nations are starting to push a lot of populist sentiment and the rise of the right. And overwhelmingly, we can't get away from pretty much what I hate to say. I agree 100% with Hillary Clinton. I never thought I would really say anything like that, but she recently had a quote that was even put into the New York Times saying that Europe has to get a handle on migration in order to thwart populism. And I believe that immigration being the center focal point throughout basically this open immigration policy guised under the Syrian refugee crisis, which we already know is nonsense. They are not Syrian refugees. You would have to literally double the entire population of Syria, pick them up and put them into Europe to even come close to the numbers that have now entered Europe, where Germany has increased their population in 2% in 1 year, and I believe that was in 2014, 2015.
Well, they're actually slight correction. They're actually Syrian children refugees.
Yeah, every single one of them, Syrian children who all basically, by the way, they're all Christian too. Yeah. But all of these people who have been now thrown directly into Europe that have drastically started to change the culture, you're starting to see a mixture of a couple things, and it's. I was talking to you a little bit before we started, but it is essentially the rapid change of culture mixed with the inability to speak about it.
Yeah.
And I think those two combining with one another, or clashing, I'll say better, is primarily the fundamental cause of the rise of population, or at least the ability for them to get a foothold into Europe right now.
And the evidence is in Clinton herself. I mean, the big criticism of the Clinton family that Hitchens wrote about in the early 90s was their tendency to triangulate, to try to proactively adapt the viewpoints of their political opponents so that their political opponents had really nothing to run against them on, meanwhile abandoning their own constituency who would probably vote for them anyways. And so what Hillary is doing in saying, oh, Europe really needs to get their hand on this immigration thing, is to try to get in front of this wave that's coming, that even she can see now. And so when Hillary Clinton starts to change her mind on this stuff, she's riding on a bigger wave of public opinion. And she has no, dog in that fight. She doesn't care one way or the other, obviously.
It's not going to affect her in the slightest.
But the fact that she's changing her mind in public about it says something about the seriousness of what you're talking about and what you're alluding to. And the rise of UKIP might have something to do with another party that you might actually know more about than I do. What do you know about the British Nationalist Party, the BNP?
Yeah, I know about them. So I don't know as much as I would like. Primarily, they are the quintessential white nationalist slash populist group or at least what they're considered as white nationalist group over in Britain. It was funded basically on the idea of staying with the British culture, keeping British culture alive, and returning more power to the populace comparatively to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which they actually got their message across back in, I think it was like 1997, when they passed a couple laws stating that the House of Lords can no longer veto the House of Commons. So they didn't really get a foothold as a party, but they got their message across because it was kind of broad in spectrum.
Interesting. So. Yeah. When I was in debate in college, our teacher always told us that the strength of soft power movements was oftentimes contingent on there being a sort of hard power edge on the outside. So like in the go-to example they give is that, without Malcolm X, there would have been no reason for people to take Martin Luther King very seriously in the United States. You see, they're presented sort of with a choice. It's like you can either have this hard and scary looking Malcolm X kind of black nationalism, or you can have this kind of more genteel and accommodating Martin Luther King character. And if it had just been presented with Martin Luther King by himself, people might have ignored it. But presented with a choice, they'll go with Martin Luther King over nothing because they know the alternative is Malcolm X. And so it's hard from a historical perspective and from a power politics perspective to talk about the rise and the success of UKIP without talking about the the existence of groups like the BNP. And one of the interesting cases, one of the first cases I heard about back in 2012 and wrote about in The Rise of the Right in Europe was the Golden Dawn in Greece, which is you just Google image search this group and you're like, oh, they are Nazis. there's no other way around it. They're doing the salute. Even their insignia is looks like it was inspired by the swastika. All the things that Hitler did, they're doing, minus some of the more hardcore Machiavellian political assassinations and such. But if you look at Greece relative to a lot of these other countries, it seems like their big failure is they've got that hard edge that no one wants, but they don't have an intermediary position. They don't have the equivalent of a UKIP party. Yeah. They only have the BNP.
Yeah. And this is where I think there needs to be an understandable separation between Britain, inside Britain with UKIP, such as the populist light, which is what I'll call UKIP, the populist movement, which I classify under people like Viktor Orban's party the Alternative for Deutschland, which that one right there, flat out populist. Viktor Orban, the Freedom's Law and Justice Party over in Poland, as well as the Lega Norda. These are all mainstream, flat out populist parties. And then you also have the extreme far right, kind of proto-fascist parties, which is you're looking at your Golden Dawns and your British National Party, which I will classify them as far right, personally.
Oh, sure. Speaking of right and left, how do you feel about the designation of populism as being anti-democratic? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I do. That's a talk. Well, yeah. So I believe that I think people are starting to learn the flaw that pretty much anybody who's ever really tackled politics understands full well about democracy, is that it's inherently horribly flawed. In fact, even Plato thought democracy was a very stupid idea. Socrates even has a very explicit teaching of that you should never let everybody run a ship who doesn't know how.
Right.
You should have a singular captain in charge with the support of the people. So I've been saying for a long time, I'm not a huge fan of democracy. I think when we look at, I'm going to use a small side note kind of example. I think the United States democracy is gone. I really do. I think it is gone beyond repair, and we can no longer get it back. And I blame the Democrats 100% for it, because even betting men down in Vegas can put the odds at zero, absolutely zero chance of this happening now that the Democrats have flipped 40 seats in voting after the midterms, where days, weeks, and now over a month later, oh, we kept finding votes, and suddenly we just flipped it from a Republican. We flipped it from a Republican. Oh, look, a Republican got flipped. Oh, look at this. A Senate seat got flipped from a Republican, and zero have gone to the side of Republicans. The fact that you keep finding votes and Democrats keep winning, it's not a matter of these votes are hidden. It's either one, the complete and utter incompetence of the Democratic Party, the vote organizations, or it's absolutely robbed. And it's not because I support Republicans. You know I'm not Republican. I'm actually left of center. It's just a matter of that is extremely fishy. There's zero likelihood of that happening. I call bullshit. The democracy is now broken.
Yeah. Well, and you know, if that sounds conspiratorial to anyone who's suffering from a bit of amnesia, you know, whatever happened to the DNC primaries? You know, people talk about this sort of thing as a, you know, a unjustified conspiracy theories. It's like, this is the logical abductive conclusion. This is the only thing that makes sense, is these people are fighting to win no matter what, and they're messing with the voting system just like they did, you know, not even 3 years ago. It's not that. This is not that complicated. And historically speaking, this is totally normal. This is totally normal. The expectation that everyone would behave in this straightforward moral fashion where power politics is concerned is borderline absurd, you know. It's idealistic to the point of naivete.
And don't get me wrong, I understand that a lot of people will look at me and go, it's like, well, you need to have more faith in the United States. You need to have more faith that we can pull it back together. I've been called, I think the number one word that people keep calling me in regard to this is like a defeatist or something or other. But the thing is that being a defeatist or being, you know, pessimistic about our democracy, that has nothing really to do with the United States as a whole. That has to do with the outlook on democracy, because we've seen it fail so many times.
Because the United States wasn't a democracy to begin with.
We're a constitutional republic.
I mean, and you mentioned Plato before. My favorite, and I suspect that he's just plagiarizing Aristotle, but my favorite political philosopher for myself, at least this is what I find easiest to understand, is Cicero's Defense of the Republic. And he outlines, he's asked by his friends in this dialogue that he wrote, you know, tell us, what is the best kind of government? And he says, well, there's three types. There's monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And he says the best type is a blend of all three. He doesn't say that democracy should be rejected. It should only be a blend of monarchy and aristocracy. No, he says it should be a blend of all three to prevent the constant cycling through them, which is incredibly unstable and dangerous. And he says if you want to choose between one of those three, you know, all of them have problems. But of the three pure forms, democracy is probably the worst. And of the three forms, monarchy is probably the best, but all three will eventually cycle through to the next ones. You know, monarchies lead to aristocracies, which lead to democracies, which lead to monarchies again, and so on.
Which we see over in Great Britain. We'll circle it back to that. We see kind of all three going on at once. We have the House of Lords, which is your aristocracy. We have the Queen, which is your monarchy. But then we also have the House of Commons, which overwhelmingly allows the referendums and the vote of the people, which gives you forms and elements of democracy. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the democracy is not being fulfilled, and the monarchy is weak. So which aristocracy are you replacing? Do you really think that it stands as the House of Lords as being your genuine aristocracy, or do you think that it's been replaced by an oligarchy in the European Union? And this is why I think a lot of people are starting to look at leaving the EU, because they realize what they've given up. They don't have control over their fishing waters. They don't have control over their own laws or immigration policies, a lot of these things. And they don't even have rules over their speech laws. Being subject to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, this blows my mind, where Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland, just got rid of blasphemy laws. And yet they are now also subject to the ICC, which you are not allowed to criticize Islam. And so you replace one blasphemy law from Catholicism to Islam, which is, it absolutely blows my mind.
And they're not even an Islamic nation formally.
They don't really even have an Islamic population.
Yeah, yet.
So why then do you think that people are starting to turn to populism? Is the fact that regardless of whether or not you think that the aristocracy, since the Queen, we all know full well that she's not going to actually enforce any rules. She basically signs off on it and calls it good. That's right. It. The democracy right now, nobody actually is fulfilling anything from the referendum. The current Brexit plan on the table that was just introduced literally had people leaving the cabinet because they said, I cannot do this. This is not Brexit. This is Brexit in not only name only, but it literally does worse. It actually makes their attachment to the EU even worse. It puts them back in the customs union. It doesn't give them control over their fishing waters, and it puts it out into 20XX for negotiation to finally leave. And you also need the EU's approval to leave, which you don't currently. You only need Article 50 to leave, which they've already implemented. This would literally make it worse.
Well, and this is the problem with the way that monarchy and aristocracy are conducted today. And I think it's true in Britain. You were speaking of the House of Lords and House of Commons, but I think it's true in the United States as well. First of all, the British monarch in the political sense is not the Queen. It's the Prime Minister. You know, the Queen is the old monarch, but she's been replaced. And the President is the monarchic role, we could say, in the United States. But the value of having a monarch or aristocrats, you know, aside from them being a supposed expert class that could know things and do things that the rest of us wouldn't necessarily know how to do, perfectly normal, perfectly common in other fields of expertise like science or economics or poll conduction or what have you. But it was contingent upon them having some skin in the game. You know, old school aristocrats were trustworthy to fulfill this role because they had children who would inherit the role of their parents. And they said, we need to preserve this country so that my children have something to inherit. And when you look particularly at the EU, this isn't as bad in the United States, but we'll get to that in a second. The EU, this is full of a bunch of childless, nationless people. If they don't like one area, they'll move to another. They have no vested interest in the future. They're in it for some weird power trip and some crazy ideal image that they're pursuing for their own self-gratification, rather than a realistic sense of what can I leave for my children. And there's a separation there between ordinary people and the new aristocracy that Bannon has variously been talking about in his sort of tour of Europe at his Oxford Union presentation a few weeks back. You have these Davos men with no country, no family, sort of citizens of the world, which is to say citizens of nowhere, who are now running things. And in the United States, again, it's not as bad, but you have the beginnings of it. You look at a lot of these senators are senators for states that they never really lived in. Hillary Clinton was senator of New York. She didn't grow up in New York. She's not from New York. You know, she's from Arkansas. What's she doing over there? John McCain, senator for Arizona. What was he doing in Arizona? He didn't grow up in Arizona. He moved there a few months before he ran for office, you know? And so you have this sort of political class that is not operating in the way that aristocracies are supposed to operate. And you know, Aristotle talks about how there's positive and negative forms of all three kinds of government. You have good monarchs, and then there are bad monarchs. There are good aristocracies and bad aristocracies. And you have good democracies and bad democracies. A good democracy is called a polity. A bad democracy is called a democracy, which I find amusing. But yeah, it's like we've gotten the incentives all backwards these days, and we're getting the worst of all three rather than the best.
And I think that's why we're starting to see it really rise up in Europe. Obviously, we have throughout Europe, we've seen, especially, I'm going to talk about a little bit with Matteo Salvini over in Italy. Okay? They had so much leverage after it was pretty much right before the election. There was a drive-by that had taken place right next to a mosque. Okay? And the reason for it is because it was actually a politician who had been running. He wasn't even a politician. He was just a guy running for politics. And he got so sick and tired of and fed up of everything that had been going on. And the tipping point was after they discovered a young girl who had literally been murdered, chopped into bits, and then shoved into suitcases. Okay? And her body part was literally just shoved into suitcases ready to be disposed of. And that was the tipping point for him. And with that being translated over into the UK and Denmark and Sweden and multiple other places, you're starting to see one overarching theme is the inability to speak out against it.
Yeah.
And it's because they're all controlled by the EU, where they have explicit anti-hate speech laws. With anti-hate speech laws, I was talking to you about this before. I always recommend to really take a look at whether the state or organizations, anything. There's a book by Albert Hirschman named Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And it's the idea that no matter what happens, you pretty much have three choices. That pretty much has to be done in any kind of free society. We can even use it as Coca-Cola. So if Coca-Cola changes their recipe and you don't like it, you can either buy Pepsi, they screw Coke and you leave, or you can also call them on the little number on the can saying, hey, I don't like this, you should change it back. And if enough people do it, they should change it back. Or you could not give a shit and actually just stay loyal to the company and carry on the way you were. But they hope full well that if too many people voice, they're hoping that you don't exit, and so they might change back, that your opinion actually matters. Right now in the EU, being held completely unaccountable by bureaucrats throughout Brussels, there's no way that they actually feel represented. The Greeks couldn't even get the posterity measure passed that they wanted to when their money was going tits up, or their economy was going tits up. So when you can't be represented by the bureaucrats in Brussels and you can't talk about it, and they're still implementing changes that's rapidly changing your entire society, your culture, your nation, everything about your entire life, sooner or later, it will get to a tipping point if you cannot voice it, you can't exit, and you're definitely not loyal to it.
So when you take away speech and exit, it creates a magical fourth option that the politicians never anticipated before. Crazy. Oh my gosh, how is this happening?
And this is where you and I completely and utterly agree with Hillary Clinton. Yes, yes, you are. You have to stem the immigration because that's what people want to voice against. It's not because they don't like brown people. It's not because they don't like Africans. They want their country not flooded and change of their culture within a single generation. Being, again, a left of center kind of person, what's his first name? Zakaria.
Fareed Zakaria.
Yeah. Thank you. Fareed Zakaria actually did a great piece on it on CNN. Yes, I know I might recommend CNN, which none of your listeners will ever pretty much take me up on, but he actually really did. It was a fantastic piece. He said it was immigration in Europe needs to be rethought because there's only so much a single generation can take in change before they start not only pushing back, but pushing back rapidly and potentially violently.
Well, the problem, and this is where I understand some of the more far right's kind of, not even skepticism, it's more like suspicion on this whole Jonathan Haidt, Jordan Peterson approach. And I guess now Fareed Zakaria and Hillary Clinton are coming around to this, which is that they still want the change to happen. They still want to fundamentally change these countries. They've just realized that they need to, as one commenter in a previous video put it, They just need to boil the frog a little bit slower to keep him from jumping out. And the problem is that the frog in question doesn't want his country to boil. He actually doesn't want his country to change at all. And the majority of people don't. And the politicians are like, well, if we can change it slowly enough, we can do what he doesn't want us to do without him noticing it. And the problem is that they're kind of right. They can do that. They have been doing that. That's what's happened in the United States over the last 50 years or so. And you get a lot of Gen Xers and boomers who, they see some changes, but they don't really think that America is in a fundamentally different position than it was in 50 years ago, when the reality is that we're in a dramatically different position. You know, we have experienced the largest human migration in all of recorded history and archaeological history, for that matter. You know,
I would
we've
say
taken
Germany
in
holds that now, but
no, not even close. Germany has taken in a few million people. The United States has taken in something like 60 million people in the last 60 years, which is
more along the lines
unheard
of per capita or per population count and percentage increase.
Oh,
they by 2% in 1 year, which is pretty much astronomical.
That's monstrous, yeah. But we're even if you look at it from a ratio perspective, we're not that different. And what's interesting about the United States is that because it's so large, the distribution is uneven. And so a lot of areas will get completely unaffected by it and think, oh, everything's going along as normal, because they're not aware that, you know, Minneapolis and St. Paul is now almost more Somali than, you know, Germanic Nordic, as it traditionally was. You know.
And I wanted to touch on your point that it reminds me of a point that you had kind of brought up earlier. It's about the ability for assimilation. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if we go down into Federal Way, I know you've been down there quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
Federal Way is pretty much either Somali Town or Koreatown, whichever one you want. It's kind of a mixture of the two. It used to be more Korean, but I think that it's now actually becoming more of a Somali haven. And with that being said, whether or not that's a good thing, it's up for a debate.
Well, it depends a great deal on if you're Somali or Korean or Anglo-American.
But I do fear one thing, and it's the same thing that I fear down in Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, and Texas, is the fact that it's one thing to increase the amount of immigration to your country. It's a separate thing when there's an absolute inability for you to implement any form of assimilation, because there's just pockets of their own community that spring up and are pretty much self-contained. When you have such a large population, you don't have to go and experience the culture of the host country, in which case there's no purpose, reason, or, you know, there's not a lot of desire to pretty much assimilate. And so if you don't have the reasoning to do so in order to thrive in the country, it's going to create that system where they don't have to assimilate. It will create that definite distinction between the native population and the immigrant population, and you wonder why they feel like outsiders. You have outsided yourself. You have drastically separated yourself to such a degree where we have no contact with you. And then if you also bring in, crime, when crime rises in that area, of course, whether it's even their doing or not, of course we're going to attribute it to you, because you're the only ones living in the fucking area.
Yeah, so, first of all, it's very hard to learn a new language to adapt to a new culture. So if you have the opportunity to not do so while you're in this new environment, of course people are going to take the opportunity to not do that. But this is one of the big critiques that I heard Douglas Murray make about multiculturalism in Britain in particular. You have these different groups of people who've moved in such large numbers that they can live in little Chinatowns, or Pakistani towns in their case, and live essentially parallel lives without ever needing to interact or even necessarily learn the language of their host country. And that's going to create conflict over time, because there's no point of common ground necessarily, and that's even true economically. You know, you've got these different groups who are adapting different essentially different survival strategies. And sometimes those differences are not just different and parallel to each other, but sometimes they're outright parasitic, and that's inevitably going to create not just conflict but intense resentment and hatred as well.
Yeah. And I hate to plug your book, but that was actually a central theme of your first book, In Defense of Hatred.
Well, and you had been talking about, let me check, make sure we're not ignoring too many. I think that's defeatist. I have faith republics more than democracies. We'll have to respond to Zigaton's comments in a second here. But yeah, well, I mean, one of the big motivations for me writing In Defense of Hatred was the subject of free speech, actually. And the introduction, for those who haven't read it, is all about defending free speech, and specifically this concept of hate speech, which Kyle was alluding to before in the European Union. You know, a prohibition on hate speech is essentially a prohibition on the emotion of hatred. It is a legal, it's a legal prohibition of this emotion. And if you dig down into the origins of where hatred comes from, you're prohibiting love for your country, at least prohibiting love for a particular conception that you have of your country. Now, it's certainly up to debate whether, your conception of what your country is truly about. What is the essence of your country? That's always a subject of discussion and even debate. But to say that you're not allowed to, feel any resentment or hatred about the destruction of something you love is, it's not just inhuman. It's just not going to work. And the more you press down on that, or you're going to destroy love outright, which is sort of what we're going towards. But
which I really want to go into, actually, the destruction of love, because I think right there, that perfect statement is the fact that you have now destroyed the idea that you are allowed to hate something emotionally. You're not allowed to speak of it. You're barely allowed to have the emotion at all. In which case, sooner or later, will destroy the love that you have for your own country, or the love you have of what is there currently. And I think that may be one of the inevitable variables in the destruction of our society, for the implementation of our societal decay. This is the speech that I normally have on gun rights, which is primarily we have had guns as part of our culture here in the United States since pretty much 1776, when we were founded, even then before then. But we haven't had these mass shootings, which I agree are a problem. We all agree that these mass shootings that are taking place in schools and soft targets are a problem. Why are they coming about when guns have been part of our culture for the last 200 plus years, 230 plus years? There obviously is a different variable that's taking place that is causing the societal decay, that we no longer see each other as a community, and we can't love each other. There is no love amongst each other because we don't know each other. We don't recognize each other. And even scientifically speaking, we know full well that if you have a rapid shift in demographics, sooner or later, the populace's willingness to vote for or implement any kind of social welfare will decrease drastically.
Yeah, absolutely. And the angle I went in the book was all about, if you take away the necessary mechanisms for defending what you love, then you're going to disincentivize people to love in the first place. But I think you're also right that, like, when you take away that moment of individual recognition between different people, you also take away the necessary grounds for people being able to even possibly love in the first place. This is a subject of another tangent. Another one of my favorite philosophers, Matthew Crawford, talking about attention and the way we protect ourselves from the distraction of the sort of modern approach to other people's attention, which is to say it's ours for the taking, is to hide away and to get on our cell phones and put in earbuds to escape the distraction, and that takes away from the conflict and the moment of recognition and the possibility for love or rejection in the outside world as well. So before I forget, let me scroll through some of these chats, which we've been religiously ignoring in the past. But Zigaton has had a bunch of things to say.
I actually called it out. Apparently, he did call me a defeatist. Look at that.
Oh yeah.
Called it.
Those that hold, how could enforcing or encouraging assimilation grow in popularity? And the subject of, he brings up the question, how could they be convinced to show assimilation is the better option in the long run? And I assume by they, Zigaton is referring to the immigrant populations, like the Mexicans coming up from the southern border, or the Somalis and Pakistanis moving into Calais and in France and Britain. It is a very good question. It's a question I wish the EU would answer, but I think they've gone the other way and said that oh well, they don't need to integrate, and that's the whole point of multiculturalism. But I'm not sure how you can persuade those people without some sort of stick.
Well, see, I actually do have an answer for that, and I know full well that this comes down to a very awkward moment where you'll probably be very happy with me in my answer. I don't think it's a matter of convincing them. I really don't, because we can convince until the cows come home. I can convince you that going to the gym is a lot better for you, but that doesn't mean that you're going to do it. The natural human reaction to anything is to choose the easier path. And again, if you have such a large population where you don't have to, you're not going to do it, especially if you don't want to. If you don't want to, you don't have to, you're probably not going to do it. In which case, I think that it comes down to more of a small carrot, but with a big stick. And I think that when populations come in, I think that they should actually be not given the option of where to live. I think that they should be put into an area and be pretty much forced to stay there. If they're going to stay in the United States, forced to stay in a specific location for X amount of time before they can move. And then, or if they do and they are found that they are moved, it's an instant deportation. And the reason for it is because if we put people who are, let's say, Somali in Federal Way or Dearborn, Michigan, it creates a massive negative incentive for them to have any kind of assimilation. On the other hand, if you put them in the middle of Iowa, you're going to have to learn real fucking quick how to get along. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. Is it negative? Yes. Is it forceful? Absolutely. But I don't see another way to do this kind of assimilation that will allow genuine understanding of the culture, forcing them to get out of their box and actually get into what it is to be American culture. Because the people who have gone away from that and have moved into weird random areas, they actually do assimilate rather well. But those who are closer to the pockets of their own kind, they don't assimilate near at all.
Yeah, and Shadowfire brings up a point that there's issues with I think what he means is lack of assimilation, actually, when you have massive influxes that lead to political changes. And I think Kyle's point actually gets around that a little bit. If you bring people in and force them to assimilate, and you don't need to be this authoritarian, but my wife was telling me a couple of months back that apparently the policy in the United States used to be that immigrants, whether they were from Ireland or China or wherever, they would have immigration agents actually barge into their home at random points and make sure that they were cooking their potatoes and eggs in the American fashion and not in the Bulgarian or the Honduran fashion or whatever. It's like they took integration in the little things very seriously. And Zigaton says, well, maybe not force. I don't know what you think the purpose of the government is, if not the utilization of the legitimate use of force. And then the question is, well, what is legitimate? And then the question is like, well, are you an anarcho-capitalist, or do you think that there are some legitimate uses of force for the preservation of your civic structure, your nation, your culture, so on and so forth?
But I want to illustrate that. Look at how we are here in Washington. Like not just Washington, here in the United States, we do not have the same kind of massive population change that Europe is suffering from, and it's even a conflict here. we have 83%, no, 63% white population here, and the rest is mixed, 13% black, and so on and so forth. While Britain has a lot larger population of Pakistani and Middle Eastern and Africans who are moving in, and even here, it's a huge issue that is causing the change and disruption of the modern day political system. You know, being able to meme Trump into Oval Office is a huge deal, yeah. and yet it's a significantly smaller issue here than it is over, let's say, in Sweden or in Germany, where they now have lockdown no-go zones where people cannot go without police cars being, you know, assaulted, or police being assaulted, cars being attacked, so on and so forth. And there are now grenade attacks in Sweden, which I encourage you all to look up. So if you have situations like that, if we had grenades attacked here, I honestly have no clue what the local residents would do. That's just something outside of the mentality that I could even imagine happening here, a grenade attack.
DMR pickup trucks. That's what would happen.
But I think when you were bringing up the whole lack of force and what is a government, what's the role of the government, I think there is a place. I mean, I don't think that we should go in there with billy clubs and beat the shit out of them. It's like, no, good, yeah, you will move somewhere else. But it's a matter of like, listen,
that should be happening at the border.
But if we are to allow them here, which we do have an immigration system, if we are to allow them here, there has to be contractual obligations of and expectations of them to meet. And if they don't, you forfeit your ability to stay here. And it's the same way we deal with ICE is you come here, and if you broke your agreement, you're basically put onto the list, and we will find you sooner or later and deport you.
Well, and I think that's one of the other big things that has led to simultaneously the much greater immigration in the United States than in Europe, while simultaneously us Americans generally not recognizing the size of the immigration compared with the seemingly pretty dramatic effects of the relatively smaller migration in Europe, is the fact that the populations moving into Europe are dramatically more different from the host European cultures than what we're experiencing here in the United States. Like, we're getting a lot of immigration from China, a lot of immigration from India, which actually is fairly different in a number of ways, but it's not quite as dramatic.
That's not really fair, though.
But we're also getting
an artificially high increase from India.
Well, sure, but the big one is from Mexico, right? And that is aside from, you know, a surprising amount of genetic similarity to begin with, and take that as you will. For, you know, some people that's pretty big, for some people that's not as important. They're also Christian. They've also been living on the same continent for however long, you know, hundreds of years. They have been living in proximity at the border, and we share a fair bit of sort of Wild West mythology and experience together as well. There's also a little bit of like cross-border Native American heritage stuff going on too. So when Mexicans move up to the border, that's to say it doesn't cause conflict. Obviously it does. But, you know, Mexicans moving into the United States are not as big of a cultural, it's not as big of a culture shock as Pakistanis moving to Britain, because half the United States speaks Spanish anyways, even the whites, right? Whereas with Pakistan, you've got a completely different religion with imperial designs, vastly different genetic populations, vastly different cultural expectations, particularly where gender is concerned, and vastly different ideas about government as well, and no shared history or common experiences whatsoever. So that's going to make for a much more dramatic conflict.
The closest Britain has for that is the fact that it used to be a colony, but 2/3 of the world has been part of Britain's colonies at one point. So
right, yeah, and you know, just because an area was a colony of a home country doesn't mean that the citizens of that home country know much or anything about the countries that they've colonized. Most Americans don't know very much about the Philippines, let alone that the Philippines were an American colony at one point. Most French didn't know much about Algeria until a bunch of Algerians started moving to France in the early 20th century.
And you're like, fuck.
Yeah. Oh. It's like, now we know.
But right. But I don't think people quite understand the absolute crazy political situation we're in here because of the rise of the right. And so imagine if during our elections, instead of the Republicans and the Democrats facing off, instead, both parties just absolutely got decimated, and the Green Party and the Libertarian Party were the ones actually duking it out for the general election. Okay. I really want you to I see right there, you actually smile. The absolute ridiculousness of that statement puts a smile on your face, because you know full well it's not going to happen anytime soon, if at all. But with that being said, that's exactly what happened in France. Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, when they actually faced off against each other, the Front National is not a contemporary party. That's basically the Libertarian Party, even though they're leftist. They're still surprisingly a third party, what we would consider a third party. And same thing with Emmanuel Macron. His party is, again, kind of like the Green Party. It's further left than the Front National, but it's absolutely crazy how their political system has now been turned 100% on its head because of the issue regarding immigration and taxes. Because they don't want the generous welfare payments going to the people who haven't paid into the system. Especially the people who have been coming in from what's it called? Starts with an M. From Africa, Morocco. A lot of people have been coming in from Morocco, and that's a huge chunk of their population, or huge chunk of the immigrant population is coming in from Morocco. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I consider libertarianism to be of the right, for the same reason that it's not really of the left either. It's the right and left represent different conceptions of identity in a way. Conservatives and of human nature. I think Thomas Sowell's book Conflict of Visions is the go-to book on the subject. It's like, do you see human endeavors as likely to succeed and we can do whatever we want, or do you view human the human propensity for failure and vice as the prevailing one, and that our successes in the face of those things are accomplishments to be cherished and protected at all costs? And the conservative, the right-wing view is that humans are a not to delve into theological talk here, but a fallen people. Most people are by default not to be trusted because we are, as another YouTuber put it, a very tricky kind of predatory two-legged ape. And if we were left to our own devices in the state of Hobbesian war, we would be predating upon each other and killing each other right and left. And so the civilizations we've built that have allowed us to interact with strangers are not something to be taken for granted, but to be cherished and truly appreciated. That's the right-wing view. And I think the left-wing view is like, that all sounds very romantic and very grateful and everything, but we've done it all over the world. We've done it before. We can do a lot more, and we will do a lot more, and we might make mistakes, but they're really no big deal. And we should be experimenting and trying new things, and in the end, it'll all come out okay. And there's a grain of truth to both of those, obviously. We don't want to stop experimenting. We don't want to stop trying new things. But things don't always go okay. And multiculturalism and this kind of global empire that really got envisioned in the 1910s is, I think, going to end maybe not as catastrophically as communism, but it certainly has that potential if the EU and the ideological descendants of Woodrow Wilson get their way. you know, human nature is not infinitely malleable, and that's really what this is contingent upon. It's contingent upon the idea that, you know, humans can be made to not really be tribal, and I just don't think that's true.
With the idea that the whole grouping of Europe is the fact that because if you go through the United States, you see a lot of the same stuff regardless of where you go. Some people are slightly different culture, but a lot of us are pretty much the same. Some people are slightly more liberal. Some people are slightly more conservative. If you go down to the South, they don't act horribly different than the people up in Virginia or New York, Minnesota, or even Seattle. Most of us have a very common United States culture or American culture, even if it deviates, you know, a bit. Yeah. And we have those pockets of, you know, pretty different areas like the Bayou, like those, yeah, or the Amish. Those are drastically different cultures, but we see them as direct pockets. But when you're looking at Europe, you cannot tell me that the Italians, the British, the Ukrainians, and the Hungarians all have such a similar culture that who have been warring for literally thousands of years now. You cannot just say, well, guys, don't worry, we signed a piece of paper, you're all the same now.
Yeah.
And we formed an economic union, don't worry, we're all the same now. That doesn't mean that people are just going to sing, you know, kumbaya. Sooner or later, you're going to find yourself in conflict at these rapid changes with absolutely zero ability to actually implement any kind of change in your now government.
Hey,
and
Kyle, I'm going to go run and answer the call of nature over here. Why don't you answer some of the questions in the comment section? I'll be right back.
Sure. Okay. Oh, there's quite a few. Okay. Let me take a look. I'm going to go down from Zigatron. Our principle and freedoms and what we stand for. Okay. So enforcing English standards. Yeah, we probably should enforce. In fact, actually, I'm not even going to put in probably. We absolutely should enforce forms of English. That is the United States formal language. We utilize it in not only our schools, our government, and every other form of kind of interaction that we hold. I put it, so my degree is in economics, and I see the same English the same way I see currency. And I know this is kind of a weird thing to think about, but what happens when you have a competing currency? And how can you have a competing currency? Is when sooner or later it gets implemented enough into the cultural dynamic that whatever currency starts flooding in, I can actually use the Iranian rial as an example. The Iranian rial has lost roughly, or it's gone up about 56,000% in inflation, and that's a lot. That's an extreme amount. But with that being said, they're utilizing the U.S. dollar, and they're actually utilizing it for a lot of transactions from day to day. And the reason for it is because they want to hold on to it for a certain amount of time, but they want to get rid of the rial as fast as they can, because almost by the day it becomes worth less and less and less as inflation rises. For big purchases, especially outside of the country, they are starting to use US dollars because it actually holds its value. And that's when you actually have a competing currency, is if it actually sustains its worth, it is implemented and ability to be traded freely, or at least to a huge degree throughout the population, and it can be utilizable, and the populace has accepted it, essentially, which goes back to the language. With the language, if they're starting to become a different language that is starting to be utilized as a trade language here in the United States, where if you go into this area, you're not going to be able to get along without using that different language. You know, you're not, sooner or later, it will start to hold its value, it'll start to see its importance rise, and overwhelmingly, English will start to fade away, and that's when we have a competing, not only currency, if we were to utilize the Iranian rial example, but if we were to utilize Mexican Spanish in the language idea, sooner or later, that competing language will be just the same as a competing currency. It will start to erode at not only the economic viability of the country, but also the infrastructural language barriers between the people, where it will start to separate the populace. So do I think that we should enforce English standards? Not only absolutely, but fuck yes, absolutely.
So I missed the early part of this, but if we're talking about competing languages, people owe it to themselves to read the free chapter from Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, called "The Least Tolerant Wins." It should be available on Medium, and he talks about how did every beverage become kosher. Seems like an odd designation for Cokes and Pepsis and beverages like that. And yet, if you know what to look for, you find out that the vast majority of those beverages are kosher. And the reason is that non-Jewish people will drink kosher beverages. I certainly will. Well, what's it to me? But Orthodox Jewish people will not drink non-kosher beverages. So there's an asymmetry in toleration. And at a certain point, it becomes more advantageous for companies to just produce exclusively the thing that one group will only have and the other group will sometimes have, because it's just better for their bottom line. And so if you get into a situation in the United States where, you know, whites are forcing their children to learn Spanish as a second language, for example, but because it's like the economically good thing to do or whatever, you have a better chance of getting a construction job for certain. But the Hispanic families are not doing the same with English. Then it is inevitable that the tide of language will eventually turn to Spanish. And that's kind of a hypothetical example to explain the point. I don't know if Spanish is likely to overtake English in that way, given how advantageous it is to Spanish families to learn English, and many of them are doing that. Well, but the point is the same.
Yeah, I utilize the a competing currency as the way that it starts to really hurt people. Pretty much, if a competing currency comes in because it holds its value more and people utilize it a lot more than the actual currency, sooner or later it will start to destroy the economy as a whole. The same thing with the language mentality and the culture. If you have competing cultures, sooner or later, it's exactly what happened in pretty much the entire Balkan states. Mm-hmm. They broke up into what we have now, primarily because they spoke different languages, had different cultures, and utilized different means to express themselves than everybody else. And so they separated. They wanted to become independent. And if you have a vie for independence here in the United States, well, that's not really going to preserve a lot of culture now, is it?
Right. And the same principle applies. You brought up different culture with, I think, to go back to something we were talking about before, religion. Islam is perhaps the most obvious example of a toleration asymmetry, where Islam, you know, the West is willing to tolerate criticisms of Christianity, and themselves, they actually bask in criticisms of their own country. We read A People's History of the United States for fun, whatever else we do. Whereas Islam is like, not only do we not really like being criticized, but we actually like to behead and defenestrate people who criticize us. You know, in the short run, that seems laughable and like, oh, they just aren't cultured. But in the long run, it's actually a very a mathematically sound strategy, and they're winning.
Okay. So with that being said, this is where I was actually sent a picture the other day by a friend of mine who is in Germany, right? Her name is Lena. And she sent me this picture, and basically it was in German, but there were translations into, I believe it was Farsi. And everything that basically was said is like, listen, if you guys want to go home, we'll help you, and here's the program. Okay? Does that sound bad to you?
Sounds xenophobic and racist and possibly homophobic is what it sounds like.
But that's all it was. Is basically, hey, this is Germany. If you guys want to go home, here's a program for it, and we will even help pay for you to get home. And the culture in Germany has now switched to such a weird cultish acceptance that literally they sent it to me. I'm in a small chat group with a British girl, a trans man, female and a male, and then a German girl, which is Lena. So it's a very interesting chat. But they sent me this, and basically they were upset about this, saying that it was racist, saying that these things that were pretty much innocuous. They're like, oh, you pretty much, they have a large percentage of people who have come into the country. A lot of them may want to go home, and we're going to help them get home. What a horrible, horrible effect is. We're not going to storm in their doors and kick them out. It's just going to be a simple, we're going to help you get home.
If you want.
Yeah, if you want. It's by your choice. And yet, that one right there, they saw it as horribly racist, as xenophobic, as Islamophobic, and it was just saying, hey, we'll help you out getting home.
Yeah, and there's almost like an implicit, like, or not, you know, that's okay too, whatever you want at the end of that sentence. You can't get more wishy-washy than that.
But that's why I'm saying it's almost a cultish kind of acceptance where it doesn't matter what it is. If it's not the absolute far left acceptance of we will bring in no matter who it is, no matter what. In fact, I think it was Angela Merkel who literally said there is no such thing as a native German, or there is no German culture. There is nothing to what it means to be German. And the same thing with Justin Trudeau in Canada. There's no such thing as an actual Canadian. There's no Canadian culture. This erasure of
what's a subgroup
of even the mere existence of a culture, and yet if we were to do the exact same thing in their country,
that would be racist. There's no such thing as an Afghani.
It blows my mind. It does. It absolutely blows my mind that some of the people who, don't get me wrong, Jenny and Lena are absolutely fantastic girls. They're great people in general. Yeah. I do enjoy talking to them, but some of the ideas that they have as a citizen of the world is, to me, insane, harmful, and just bar none insane.
Well, I think Germany is suffering from a particularly malignant kind of pathological shame over the Second World War that they've never really lived down. They're trying to go above and beyond the extra mile in making amends for you know, the world's perception of Hitler. And I think that like one interesting example of this is that Hitler supposedly had like a living cousin or something, or a number of like extended family members who really had nothing to do with him. Apparently, they have all taken vows of celibacy, or at least of not having children. And you're like,
they want Hitler's bloodline to die.
This is really strange. I thought we didn't believe in the importance of genetics for determining character. What's all this about? And I feel like this vow to destroy your own bloodline for something that a relative did, but something that you didn't do, is sort of symbolic of Germany's attitude as a whole. Like, we will kill ourselves and our line as an apology to the world for this. And it's like, you, like, and if that were it, it would just be tragic. But because Angela Merkel is one of the big people in the EU and they want to do this for the entire continent of Europe, it's beyond tragedy and it's now a threat.
Well, an interesting point was brought up to me the other day. I was talking to a buddy of mine, Mark, and he brought up the idea that potentially this European army that they're speaking of is actually potentially a good thing. And the reason for it is because the rest of the EU probably does not trust Germany unchecked. and
we need one more German empire, a Fourth Reich. That'll do it.
Like, with Angela Merkel stepping down, she's probably going to hand off the reins to someone that she approves of, as well as she's been kind of mentoring Emmanuel Macron for the last couple of years. And since they've been doing it for the last couple of years, Macron is you have to take it from. See, I want to think about it in a personal standpoint of how I would personally think about it, but because it's really difficult to put myself into the brain of Emmanuel Macron. Like, putting myself in the shoes of a European leader right now is basically me shooting myself.
Can you put yourself in Hillary's shoes?
In what?
Can you put yourself in Hillary's shoes? Because I don't think those would be a significantly different size
Well,
than
yeah, it would
Macron's
be
or.
pretty easy. Just any enemy that I don't agree with, I should just kill. Seth Rich did nothing wrong. But with that being said, from my perspective, if I were Emmanuel Macron, I would look at the rising of a European army with Angela Merkel being at the head of it, as probably one of the most influential members of the EU, being able to almost command anything she says into reality throughout the EU, and Jean-Claude Juncker over in the European Commission. But imagine France, who hasn't spent pretty much anything in military spending, Germany, who has now been ramping up military spending because of Trump's rhetoric saying that you guys have to pay your fair share or we're not going to fulfill the promises of NATO.
Oh, Dave Martell is here. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat a little bit as well.
No, you're fine.
Yeah. Anyways, continue. I'm sorry.
And then you also have now the rising conflict with Ukraine and Russia again. We had it with the Crimean incident, and now we're looking at, and of course, their invasion of Georgia back in, I think it was like 2013, 2012, something like that. So I want to know what in the world Emmanuel Macron or any of the European leaders would be thinking with the rise of a European army, with Germany being one of the main heads of it.
Yeah.
I mean, if they don't trust their bloodline, if Hitler's family really will not procreate because of Adolf Hitler just being in their genes in some capacity, what then do you think of the actual German people? Do you trust the German people? Do you actually want to ally yourself with the German people?
Well, here's an interesting psychological hypothesis here. So Karl Marx, when he was writing about religion and about because the phrase Jewish question was coined by Karl Marx, as far as I'm aware.
Yes.
But his writing on the subject, because he was himself Jewish, was that the great thing about communism for Jews is that it would free them from the oppression of Jewish identity itself. And Marx himself, despite being a Jew, was not a huge fan of Jewish identity. He even gets accused of being anti-Semitic by a few people, which is interesting. And so communism became very popular among a number of Jews who were kind of tired of being Jews and being treated like Jews by other people. It said, here's a new identity we can create ex nihilo for ourselves. And I wonder if a lot of these childless, old, guilty German bureaucrats see the European Union as kind of new communist identity, an escape from German identity and an escape from association with Hitler. That would it would seem to explain both the guilt and the shame and the destruction of the bloodline, while simultaneously holding this kind of audacious, self-righteous self-assurance in their own power and this lack of introspection, because we're in a new identity now. And it's like if you still thought of yourself as German, the way you're talking about Germany and German history, you would have none of this, self conscious or none of this self-assuredness that these European bureaucrats have now, but they do. It's like they've shrugged off that and taken on all the self-assurance that Hitler had, but it's not German, so it's okay.
Now, since it's under the guise of the European Union, see, I tend to stay away from psychology a little bit, kind of putting myself in the mind of European leaders, so on and so forth. I try to stay away from it because I know full well if anybody were to hear me,
it's just a hypothesis.
That if anybody were to hear me talking about psychology, they would pretty much shame me, because I actually know a couple psychology majors, and they would just make fun of me and point out how I'm wrong and stupid. So I'm going to stay away from psychology a bit. But with Karl Marx,
never say the word negative reinforcement around a psychology major unless you know exactly what those terms mean technically.
I don't know about you, but Freud was a genius and right about everything.
And a scientist, yes.
Yeah, but I think that this is what I was talking about earlier, is the Albert Hirschman, and swinging back to a little bit of Europe overall and the rise of populism and the rise of the radical right. Not even the radical right. I'm not even going to say radical, because I don't think that a lot of the modern day populists are radical right. But the the idea that you've taken away their ability to voice opposition to what's going on. Sooner or later, it's the same thing under Sun Tzu, is that you never, ever, under any context, leave your opponent with no exit. Yeah. Because if you give them absolutely no exit, sooner or later they will be able to fight with the tenacity of an army 10 times the size. They will defeat you. So you have to give them an out. And when they take it, that's when you'll definitely strike. But with the people in Europe right now, they don't have an out. Psychologically speaking, they're in a mental prison.
Yeah, and to assume that the fenced-in group won't fight with the ferocity of an army 10 times the size is to assume that, you know, the population that you're looking at is exempt in some way from the laws of human nature. I'm a literary guy by nature, and one of the books I finished recently and one of the books I'm reading right now, respectively, are Chuck Palahniuk's Adjustment Day and William S. Lind. There we go. William S. Lind wrote a book called Victoria, which is a novel of fourth generation war. And both of these books are populist fantasies of basically, I'm not all the way through Victoria yet, but they're populist fantasies of basically murdering all of the politicians and media and academics, and going. These are fairly popular books. You know, Palahniuk's book only came out in May of this year, so it's still fairly new. William S. Lind's book came out in 2014, but it's under the name Thomas Hobbes for some reason. But you know, Victoria has like 87 reviews on Amazon, and Palahniuk's book has been getting reviews all over the place. It's quite popular. These are popular sentiments, and like you said, if they're not left with an out, there's that fourth option that keeps popping up, and we're already beginning to see, you know, little micro instances of it with Anders Breivik, for example. That was a populist guy, and people think it was racially motivated. It wasn't. It was politically motivated. He was attacking basically a young communists, or it was some labor socialist youth camp where they were basically grooming the next generation of communist leaders. And supposedly that Communist Party in Norway has not recovered. Like, that was a very serious blow to their infrastructure and their future generation of leadership. And I expect we'll be seeing a lot more of that in the coming years in Europe and in the United States.
They've been slowly but surely disarming the populace. We can already be well aware of that. We see them trying to turn knives in over in Britain. And when you're trying to yeah, I know, right? Oh, what are they going to do after they ban guns? Like, are they going to ban knives? Oh, well, yes, we literally have an example of it. Yeah. It's Great Britain. Good job, guys.
Will they ban fertilizer? Will they ban rust?
Well, will they ban acid from being thrown in people's faces? Oh, they have rising rates of acid attacks? Fuck. So, but since they've been disarming the populace, they have no, I think they understood full well that they are caging in the animals. Psychologically speaking, they are imprisoning these people from being able to speak, being able to actually voice their opposition to what's going on. They have no control. You're basically in the European Union, and you can't really go anywhere else because traditionally, like from here going over, understanding that they can go from like, well, you can just go to a different country because you're part of the EU. You can go from like Hungary over to Poland, and Poland to UK, UK to Spain. Yeah, that's the kind of freedom of movement inside the European Union. But there is a cost to get to other countries. Other countries don't just let you come and stay. You can visit and spend your money, but you can't stay. They will kick your ass back out. And since they don't have an exit anymore, because the vast majority of countries who look at the EU and say, no, we don't want you coming here because you're white, especially down in Africa, they don't want people coming there who are white traditionally. China, they don't really want white people living there. Japan, to become a citizen is nigh impossible. Yeah. So the only real place to leave to is the United States. the United States and Canada is pretty much the only real destination for Europeans to go now who want to leave the oppressive mental kind of prison that they've got going on there. And it's a sad realization where they can't just go wherever they want because there are rules in place that you can't just go places. So sooner or later it's going, and with the disarmed populace, I think they understood full well what they were doing, because now they're hedging their bets, knowing full well that sooner or later it's going to be violent, and we literally just have to stomp them down into submission.
And the same people who are saying, oh, we really need to curb immigration are the same ones who created this problem to begin with, as if they are now the solution to the problem they started, which is insulting as well as a little audacious. But we've been going for almost an hour and a half now. So in talking about sort of the nature of this rise of the right and some of the examples and possibly some of the causes and implications, I think we should probably end by well, mostly me asking you, because I'm sure everyone already has an idea of my opinion on it. But do you think this rise of the right is a good thing in Europe?
So I do think it's bleeding. And I'll answer your question here in a second. It is bleeding because we already see the election of Belisario down in Brazil. Okay, and he's absolutely a rightist or a right leaner, and he was actually favoring the military kind of dictatorship that Brazil had for a good long time. But is it a good thing? The thing is that I think, you know me not to be a Republican or a rhino or anything of those sorts. I'm actually rather left of center, as you already know. And this stint of conservatism that I do have...
You're a libertarian, be honest. You're not some kind of progressive or
no, I'm not a progressive. Like I'm left of center. But it's hard to say libertarian because like the contemporary libertarian basically doesn't want a state. And that's nonsense. I do want a state because I'm not stupid. On the other hand, it's kind of an odd scenario whether or not it's a good thing, because I think in drastic correction to the left, I think it's a good thing. Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, I do fear what can potentially become in a direct opposition to the left. Because does it have the propensity to? Yes, because anytime we see a massive swing of the pendulum to one side or another, it's not good. I think this right now is a failed pendulum swing to the left, where they tried to take it further than people were willing to go. And in direct opposition to that, people will swing it way too far to the right. If we were to stick with the Fidesz party for Viktor Orban, the People's Freedom Party in Poland, the Danish People's Party, or the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Sweden, even UKIP, and the Catalonian independence movement, I think if those are the middle grounds for populism, sticking in those realms and staying further away from like the Golden Dawn Party and a couple others, I think, and the British, the BNP, I think those, if we can stay away from those and stick with the kind of contemporary populism, I think not only would it be a good thing, I think it'll actually get people to realize the direct flaws in democracy and implement specific changes to alter them in a way that is actually more representative of what the people want, and stay away from the Giovanni Gentili ethical state issue.
So by too far to the right, do you mean
too militarized? The right and the left is complicated at this point, because whether you're speaking economically, politically, fascistically, and whether or not you even consider fascism in the right or the left, because you and I understand, like, when you say right and left, it's almost per that very specific topic.
Yeah, because when I think of like how far right wing can I imagine, the farthest right I can imagine is basically Amish, you know. which is not intrinsically bad. There's nothing really threatening about it, you know, except
for they have a left-wing economic policy.
Well, left-wing by what metric? You know, there are very many old right-wing critiques of capitalism. I've been reading one poem in particular by Ezra Pound, who was a fascist from Idaho, apparently, and you know, there are plenty of right-wing critiques of just open free markets, which is again why talking about libertarian as being right-wing or left-wing is like kind of not really sure when you fit it into the model of right-wing as tradition-oriented and preserving what we have accomplished, whereas left-wing is like keep exploring, keep striving, keep, you know, moving towards the pinnacle. And that's what in its greatest forms led to some of the liberal policies of the Enlightenment era, and in its worst forms, what led to communism. We can do better. We can overcome human nature itself. No, you can't.
We're not going to be able to overcome human nature, and the more we try, the more violent of a resistance you're going to have. It's been done. It's rebelled against. I don't see people trying to escape a free capitalist country from underneath a barbed wire fence. Going off of the comments, yeah, you're not going to be able to ban hands. That's just not going to happen, and that's what you're going to have to do to be able to pretty much put them into that kind of subjugation again, especially in the Balkans. They gave up their sovereignty, and they gave up their pretty much their humanity to the Russian to the Russian communist state, and they're refusing to go back. They will refuse at every chance from going back into a communist state. And so, do I think it's a good thing? Yes. I think that there's going to be so much sabotage in this happening with Brexit right now. They're absolutely sabotaging Brexit. Theresa May is on quote stating that it's either this deal, no deal, or no Brexit. And when the conservative Tory prime minister is stating that, oh, well, we may not even have a Brexit anymore. Yeah, gee, I fucking wonder. Maybe it was a bad idea to put a prime minister who was on the Remain side from being prime minister in charge of making the deal.
And it's like the people are like, well, it's either this deal, no deal, or no prime minister.
Yeah. And so just looking at this, where they're talking about another people's vote, another referendum that they want to have, which, by the way, they only have about 6 weeks to be able to put onto the docket, because as per UK law, you have to have 10 weeks before you can even implement any kind of legislation. But since this is going to be sabotaged at every level, okay, unless they hit no deal at this point, there's not going to be any kind of non-sabotage happening. So is it an uphill battle? Yes. But I think that when they do this, that kind of thing, that sabotage against Brexit, the sabotage against the Catalonian independence movement, the sabotage of Geert Wilders over the Danish People's Party, another example was the sanctioning of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Poland from the EU from not allowing immigration in. The more you sabotage this, the more violent of a reaction you're going to have. The more crazy of a button someone is going to have to push in order to reset to normal. Because you've pushed it so far to get back to normalcy, we not only have to get back to normal, but now we have to undo some of the damage you've done.
And it's funny, I was reading something about this that reminds me of all this. None of this is new. At the very end of the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta finally defeated Athens, and they installed a puppet Congress, essentially, of 300 senators who were supposed to come up with a new constitution for Athens to prevent it from tyrannizing all of its neighbors, as it had been doing. But those 300 congressmen didn't establish this Congress. They kept deferring it and instead used their position of power to establish themselves as tyrants over the city. And the paradox was that the more they tyrannized the Athenian population, the more the Athenian population fought back and eventually overthrew and executed those 300 tyrants. And I think that in a similar way, the more tyrannical the EU becomes, the more of a right-wing response people are going to get in response. So the question the EU has to ask itself is, how right-wing do they want Europe to be?
Yeah, and is it worth it?
Yeah. Yeah, and for what ends that they're not going to get anyways. So, well, it's been great chatting, Kyle. I think we need to. I need to get going and do some other stuff over here. But I'm sure we'll be talking more in the future about other things, and probably similar things too, as Europe continues to unfold itself.
I encourage everybody to look up a lot of what's going on, the rise of the right over in Europe. It's going to be it's going to be interesting. We love watching this. We're political diehards, and this is just an interesting fact of life, where we see this is going to change the world for the foreseeable future. This is going to alter what Europe is. It's going to have a direct hand in what the United States is going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'll be interesting and potentially tragic, potentially heroic. We'll have to see how it plays out. I'm not willing to make any predictions just yet, except that things are probably going to get worse before they get better.
A lot. I agree.
So, anyways, thanks for chatting, Kyle, and we'll talk more in the future.
See you, brother.